The Power of the Rings of the Lord of Ring Power. Episode 6 brings together the Numenor story, Galadriel, and the Southlands all at once because the beacons are lit and the Southlands call for aid. I've seen a lot of people saying that this is the best episode in the series. Is this true? Well, I want to talk through one puzzling thing, the good things, and the bad things. Tell me one thing you loved, and if one thing frustrated you down below. And again, I love hearing from non-Tolkien people because they can look at this without the tinted glasses that, I have. I'm really interested to know, what the average person who doesn't know the lore, who doesn't know the story, thinks about this that isn't wrapped up in it. I'm very curious. If you are that sort of person, please do let me know. I'd love to read your comments. First, the puzzling. Okay, so tell me if I have gotten something wrong or if I'm missing something, please, alright? But the orcs, in the beginning of the episode, they arrive and they find that Ostirith is empty. The villagers have abandoned it. And then Arondir brings the tower down on top of them, okay? I feel like I must have missed something because, one, how did the villagers get out of Ostirith and hundreds of meters behind the orcs? I thought the point was that they were cornered, and the only way up was this winding path and this one bridge, because like last episode, they were completely out of food, none of them really wanted to fight, so I thought the only reason that they didn't just leave over the mountains was that for some reason they must have been cornered. Two, I suppose they thought they could kill more orcs by bringing the tower down on top of them, rather than using it as a defensible position, but this feels like a very strange decision to make when they already abandoned the village because it was indefensible. Like, I could believe it if, the tower was basically a ruin. There was no way that they could stop the orcs getting in, but there is a perfectly narrow bridge that they have to cross that they can fight at. And given that they were going to choose to fight them anyway, it's odd that they would fight them in what I think is pretty clearly a less defensible position. I don't know. Please tell me if I've missed something. I've only watched the episode 1.5 times because, to me, my feeling is that the writers literally kind of wrote themselves into a corner, maybe, and they needed to have that moment where the cavalry, the Numenorean cavalry, come in to save the day, but that's very difficult with how Ostirith and this tower is positioned. So they needed the villagers back down in the valley. But Part 2, the good things. The moment where Arondir is seeing the orcs trickling back into the valley and we slowly see all of their little torches and the music that came with that, like this, jangling horror music, that was really good. It was actually genuinely chilling. And then later on when that orc is bleeding out of his eye down into Arondir's mouth, added in some disgust, but I think for effect it worked quite well. I also like, and I know a lot of people aren't going to agree with this, but I like how Arondir fights. I like how they film it. There's a fluidity and flexibility and kind of rhythm to it that's very elvish in my mind. I think they captured that pretty well. The moment where they catch the orcs in that crossfire between the two walls of flame was quite good, because I remember sitting there and thinking, this does not look like all of the orcs that were coming. And, this feels too easy. Because, of course, it was too easy, and it was not all of the orcs. It was, in fact, their fallen, turned comrades, right? I thought that was nicely set up and nicely paid off. Parallel to this, we have Numenor riding in true Tolkien fashion and arriving at the break of dawn. I am not a filmmaker. I don't know anything about the craft. But I liked how it was shot, it was pretty, and it felt like there was a lot going on in any given moment, any given shot. But there's this old piece of writing advice that coincidences which create problems are okay, but coincidences which solve problems are not. And you see, Numenor might know where this village is because of Halbrand, but they don't know that this battle is going on, and they certainly don't know that they need to ride through the entire night with absolute urgency to get there as soon as possible. That is a very lucky assumption for them to make. See, the coincidence of help people know is coming arriving at the last possible moment is okay because it heightens narrative tension, but we can compare this to the Rohirrim arriving in Helm's Deep, where the writers did so in the same way, but they knew about the sense of urgency. They knew what they were going to find. They knew why they had to get there. There's no lucky guess at play there. They're not metagaming. They're not acting as if they have knowledge that they're in a story and what's going on outside it. Honestly, the best part of this episode for me was probably Adar. He is one of the Moriondor, which is not a term I think Tolkien uses, but it is true that in the lore some elves were taken very early on and probably corrupted in some form. He went back and forth on whether or not they were what became orcs. I like that Adar feels alien and elvish, and he's acted quite nicely, and the term Moriondor means like black or dark elf. Tolkien himself did grapple with whether, orcs are purely evil, whether they're redeemable, whether they're outside God's grace. And so, when Adar is saying, we all have the breath of the one, God, I thought that was a nice exploration. I like that they're touching on that without kind of going down the route of, orcs are just misunderstood good guys, because that's not the case. And connected to this is Galadriel, and I actually think this is probably her strongest episode, because, we actually get a chance to explore what her anger means, and it's not petty and childish like it was for most of the time in Numenor. Instead, it's this dark hole inside her that she's struggling to grapple with, this tortured, horrific past that she is struggling to move on from. And when she speaks to Adar, there's this weird sense that she finally feels like she's speaking to an equal, in a way. We also finally get some real character development, which admittedly culminates in the hashtag final solution to the orc problem moment, where she says, "I will kill all of you, even the little orc babies," which is not something I ever expected to be saying, but here we are. How did you feel about that moment? I think that within the architecture of the story as it is, that is probably where they needed to take this. Especially because it allows the story to parallel Halbrand and her and their violent tendencies and them helping each other resolve them, which actually gave us a pretty nice scene in this episode, I think. She has this moment where she pretty clearly thinks, I need to change something in myself. And I think that the trajectory for her character is going to be, something towards humility and wisdom. That is my hope. Some people have criticized, don't kill him, we need him alive. And then the next scene with him saying, "I'll kill you myself." But I mean, this isn't inconsistent character writing. This is pretty clearly, I think, in the scene, Galadriel giving into her worst instincts. It's knowing one thing and feeling another, and the conflict between them, which is so much of what writing is. Last thing I liked was Mount Doom erupting. I like how it looked. I like that this was the eventual plan for the tunnels. I like what it meant for the story. But one thing, why did the sword hilt break the dam? Ostirith was pretty clearly an elvish fortification, right? So when did Sauron build this contraption? And if the point was that they needed to blow the dam, then I don't think they necessarily needed the sword to do that. After all, they've just spent the long last while digging tunnels through earth and stone and rock. Again, kind of like the villagers coming down from Ostirith, this feels like a little bit of a contrivance to make sure that these two people clash, right? Because without the hilt, the orcs would just bypass them and go straight to the dam and then blow that, and they probably wouldn't even care about them. I'm not super bothered by it, but it did make me roll my eyes, and when there are a lot of eye roll moments, as there have been across the series, it just makes the series overall feel flat. But part 3, the bad things. As we're coming towards the end of Rings of Power, how the whole piece fits together, how it does or doesn't work, is coming clearer. And it seems like the entire crux of the story, at least up until this point, rests on 1, caring about the Southlands, 2, buying into Numenor, and 3, being invested in Galadriel and Halbrand, their arcs. And I'm not sure that the story has done any of these particularly well. While Arondir is interesting, I feel like we barely know who Theow and Bronwyn are, let alone the wider village community or the South. Bronwyn and Arondir have had maybe 2 real scenes together across the entire series, so their kiss and romance in this episode fell flat for me. And that's to say nothing of the wider village, which has done very little to endear us to them. In fact, they have been mostly ranging from frustrating to outwardly unlikable, nor does it feel like there's a strong love for their homeland that they want to defend it. The relationship between people and their home is so key in Tolkien's works, and it just doesn't come through here. The horror of Mount Doom erupting and destroying everything they have ever known could have been this really profound personal moment for a lot of characters. Like, imagine the Shire being destroyed if these places in the Southlands meant something to us. but it's not. This episode treats Bronwyn's role as leader to these people as a character arc, but we haven't seen any meaningful change in her as she takes up the leadership, nor any meaningful change in the relationships she has with others in the village and how people treat her. The only time that happened was right at the very beginning when she showed people the orc head, and that was, as said, right at the start. These people don't seem that invested in killing orcs or defending their homeland, and they don't care about each other. So I'm just not personally that invested in them at all. And this isn't about making characters likable, it's about making the stakes feel real and making us care about this story. So these sweeping moments where we look around at the village people, they work in isolation, but not within the wider context of the story arc. Theo talks in this episode about how the sword made him feel powerful, but we never really got a chance to explore that. The truth is that these characters just have had way too little screen time, or the writing hasn't given them enough space to actually develop as people, their relationships. And a lot of the time that the Southlands has had has been to develop the plot, for which a lot of them have been mostly passive observers. Then, when it comes to Numenor, this whole battle, this story beat is meant to feel cathartic, because it's Tamriel choosing the path of the faithful, rather than Numenor's prejudiced, elitist, isolationist ways. But I've talked before in previous episodes about how that conflict just hasn't been done very well, and what we have seen of it has been cartoonish and clumsy. It doesn't feel like there is a strong sense of tension or conflict on Numenor that sets up what Tamriel is supposedly giving up to be here. Ar-Pharazôn and the political situation just hasn't been developed very much. So again, this beat works in theory, it works in isolation within this episode, but not in the wider context of this story arc. I'm not that invested in which way Numenor goes, and I don't think their story is that interesting, which is, in many ways, it's like the worst thing. It's worse to be boring than to be bad. And I like Elendil, I genuinely do, but he's not enough to carry it on his own. And Isildur, Valandil, and Ontimo are pretty hit or miss for me. I don't know how you feel about them, but I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments, and it's okay if you do love them as well. Galadriel and Halbrand are of course front and center here, and the story, like with Bronwyn, treats Halbrand returning to the Southlands like a character arc. But there hasn't been one. Galadriel has told Halbrand multiple times that, hey, you need to become king, and he has said no, and then one day he did. That's not an arc. We haven't had obstacles or beats where Halbrand proves to himself or others that he has kingly qualities, that he cares about the Southlands, that the Southlands needs a king, that precipitate this moment. When Bronwyn says, "Are you the king we were promised?" I don't know why this is meaningful. If we want to compare this to, say, Aragorn, right? He has a lot of beats where he rejects the ring and sends Frodo on his way, when he takes up Anduril, when he goes to meet the Oathbreaker ghosts. These are all moments of real growth, so when Aragorn does say, hey, yes, I am the king, we know what that means for him and others. This is, by the way, setting aside the funniest meme that I've seen in a long time, where I hope Halbrand enjoys being king over all 12 of the thatched huts. Like... He's like mayor at best. But beyond all this, I think something really difficult with the show is that, I want to say boring, but what I mean is flat. There are a lot of moments across the series that you feel like they should hit harder, partly because I haven't quite bought into the tension in Numenor or in the Southlands, which has been driving the story so far, whereas I definitely have with, Khazad-dûm and Elrond and Durin. But more importantly, I think there are just a lot of moments across the series where you feel like things should be more compelling, they should hit harder, they could have been done in more interesting ways, more moving ways. Like one of them in this episode was Arendir's speech at the beginning. This is just a feeling at the moment. I need to put more thought into what that feeling is. I'm gonna do that in my big Rings of Power autopsy video, but I'm curious as to whether you feel the same way, that there are a lot of little moments where you're like, that could have hit harder if they did a little bit differently, or it should have been done differently. Things that should matter but don't narratively, mixed in with some that do. I don't know. Let me know. What do you think of the episode? Tell me down below. I am very curious as to how they're going to end the series, because we've got 2 more episodes to go, and I thought this would be basically the finale episode, but no, it is not. We shall see. Give me your predictions, stay nerdy, and I will see you in the future.